In 2014, a software engineer named Michael Thompson lost his job. Caught in an economic downturn, his family could no longer afford the high cost of living in Chicago. His wife, Sarah, found them a lifeline, a massive 1920s Victorian house on Cedar Lane in the small town of Chillicothe, Ohio. The rent was an impossibly low $400 a month, but that price tag disguised a severe problem. Between 1999 and 2014, as this timeline tracks, 7 different families moved into that property, and every single one of them fled. According to a neighbor who lived next door for 40 years, the previous tenants suffered extreme psychological breakdowns. One woman pulled out chunks of her own hair, claiming invisible things were crawling on her scalp. A 10-year-old boy obsessively wrote "She watches me" over 100 times on the basement wall. When physical spaces are priced remarkably below market value, the discount rarely comes from generosity. It usually means the property exacts a toll that money cannot measure. For the Thompsons, the symptoms of that toll started subtly. A few weeks after moving in, Michael opened the basement door and was hit by a freezing draft carrying a highly specific scent: old, rotting flowers, like decayed grave offerings. Soon after, his 7-year-old daughter, Emma, started talking to an imaginary friend she called Mrs. Bellamy. When asked what her new friend looked like, Emma described a tall woman in a white dress covered in brown stains the child specifically identified as old blood. Emma told her parents that Mrs. Bellamy was constantly crying. She claimed the woman couldn't leave the house because her physical body was trapped in the dark, down in the basement. The disturbances peaked one night at 2 a.m. Michael woke up to find Emma entirely unresponsive, sleepwalking out of her room and heading straight for the open basement door. She told her father, Mrs. Bellamy wanted her to come downstairs. Imaginary friends are a normal coping mechanism for children in a new environment, but a psychological projection has no reason to actively lure a child into an unfinished, underground space in the middle of the night. Drawn by the need to protect his family, Michael took time off work and went to the Chillicothe Public Library to dig into the property's historical archives. He discovered the house was built in 1923 by a prominent local physician, Dr. Thomas Bellamy. In 1937, his wife, Eleanor Bellamy, vanished without a trace. The mystery of her disappearance was solved 15 years later in 1952. A new owner doing renovations tore down a basement wall and found Eleanor's skeleton. Dr. Bellamy had murdered his wife and sealed her body in the brickwork. But this discovery created a logical problem. Eleanor's remains were exhumed and given a proper burial decades ago. The physical anchor to her trauma was gone. Parapsychologists often explain phenomena like this through a concept called residual hauntings. The theory suggests extreme trauma can imprint on an environment. The house acts like a sponge, absorbing pain and mindlessly replaying echoes on a loop. But Emma's experiences bypassed that. Giving a specific name requires a conscious presence, not a passive echo. If Eleanor Bellamy was already laid to rest, whatever was currently occupying the house was either a mimic using her memory as bait, or there was a piece of this crime that the 1952 investigation completely missed. Michael went down into the basement that night alone to confront whatever was calling his daughter. The moment he reached the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight died, leaving him in absolute pitch black. The temperature plummeted. Michael felt a freezing hand grab his wrist, forcefully guiding his fingers to the reconstructed brick wall. As his hand pressed against the damp surface, he felt the distinct, frantic texture of invisible scratch marks. Suddenly, Emma screamed from upstairs. When Michael ran to her room, she was sitting rigidly in bed, repeating a new message: "There are others." The entity was no longer pointing to a single victim. She was indicating that more bodies were still hidden in the house. The Thompsons fled the house that night. Michael took his findings to the police, aggressively pushing the local press until authorities finally agreed to conduct a thorough search. In November 2014, they broke open the basement floor. 4 feet beneath the dirt, far below the wall where Eleanor was found, forensic teams unearthed 2 additional sets of human remains. Dental records and bone analysis dated these skeletons back to the 1930s. They were two completely unidentified women. The respected town physician, Dr. Bellamy, had been a serial killer operating in plain sight. The disturbances at Cedar Lane were not malicious attacks. They were the only available means for these women to reveal their presence and initiate a forensic investigation. 80 years after their deaths, these victims finally succeeded in having their stories recorded by the state, using a 7-year-old girl to bridge the gap between their murders and their discovery. Today, the house on Cedar Lane stands entirely abandoned. The windows are boarded up, but locals frequently report that no matter how many times the basement door is locked, it always finds a way to swing open. When extreme violence is buried and the truth is actively suppressed, the resulting trauma does not simply evaporate. It permanently stains the physical environment. It leaves us to wonder exactly how many silenced histories are still active, waiting beneath the floorboards of the spaces we occupy every single